Jackie Chan sat in a small Hong Kong cinema in 1975, watching a Buster Keaton film from 1926 called The General. He'd seen it before, several times actually, but he kept coming back, studying the way Keaton moved, the way he used props, the precise timing that made dangerous physical comedy look effortless. On screen, Keaton was performing a sequence where he sat on the coupling rod of a moving train, completely oblivious to the danger, his body rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm while the massive wheels turned inches from his head. One miscalculation would have killed him, but Keaton's face showed nothing. No fear, no awareness, just blank innocence. The audience laughed, but Jackie wasn't laughing. He was learning. He was watching a master demonstrate something that Hong Kong action cinema had forgotten or never fully understood. That physical danger could be funny, that vulnerability was more entertaining than invincibility, that the audience didn't need to see a hero dominate. They needed to see a human being struggle, fail, and persist. Jackie had spent the past 2 years making martial arts films that tried to turn him into the next Bruce Lee, and they'd all failed because he couldn't project Bruce's intensity or power. But watching Buster Keaton nearly die on a train coupling while maintaining perfect comic timing, Jackie understood something fundamental. He'd been studying the wrong teachers. Bruce Lee was a martial artist who became a film star, but Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton were physical comedians who'd created a language of movement that transcended culture, language, and time. And that language, silent, visual, built entirely on the body's relationship to objects in space, was what Jackie needed to learn. To understand why Jackie turned to silent film comedians for inspiration, you need to understand the crisis he was facing in his career in the mid-1970s. After Bruce Lee's sudden death in 1973, Hong Kong studios were desperate to find a replacement, someone who could fill the enormous commercial void Bruce had left. Jackie was one of many young martial artists pushed into films that tried to replicate Bruce's success. He was given roles in movies with titles like New Fist of Fury, deliberate attempts to invoke Bruce's legacy, and Jackie was expected to be serious, intense, intimidating. All the things Bruce had been naturally, but it wasn't working. Audiences could see that Jackie was acting, that the intensity wasn't authentic, that he was trying to be something he fundamentally wasn't. The films failed commercially and critically, and by 1976, Jackie was convinced his chance at stardom had passed, that he'd remain a stuntman and supporting player for his entire career. He was talented, everyone acknowledged that. But talent without the right vehicle meant nothing. He needed to find a way to be himself on screen rather than a pale imitation of someone else. The answer came partly from his training background. Jackie had spent 10 years at the China Drama Academy studying Peking opera, which was fundamentally different from pure martial arts training. Opera combined fighting with acrobatics, comedy, music, and theatrical performance. The goal wasn't just to defeat an opponent, but to entertain an audience through the quality of movement, the timing of gestures, the interplay between different performers. Master Yu Jim Ewan had drilled into his students that opera was about precision and rhythm, that every movement had to be exactly timed, that sloppy execution was worse than no execution at all. Jackie had this foundation, but he hadn't fully understood how to translate it to film. Peking opera was performed live on stage for audiences watching from a distance. Film was intimate, captured in close-up, edited into sequences that didn't exist in real time. The skills were transferable, but the application was different. And that's where Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton became essential teachers, because they'd solved the problem of translating physical comedy and precise movement to cinema decades earlier, during the silent era when film had no dialogue and everything had to be conveyed visually. Jackie started systematically studying silent comedies, watching films by Chaplin, Keaton, Harold Lloyd, and others. He'd go to film archives and small cinemas that showed old movies, sometimes watching the same film multiple times, analyzing not just what the performers did, but how they did it. He noticed that Chaplin's movements were balletic, fluid, with a grace that made even mundane actions, like walking or eating, seem like choreographed dance. Keaton's movements were different, more mechanical, more geometric, with a deadpan face that never betrayed emotion, even in the most dangerous or absurd situations. What struck Jackie most was how these comedians used their entire bodies to tell stories and create comedy. A modern action star might rely on dialogue, facial expressions, or dramatic music to convey emotion. But Chaplin and Keaton worked in silence, with minimal sets and no special effects. Everything they communicated came through physical movement. The angle of a shoulder, the timing of a step, the way they interacted with objects. This was incredibly difficult, requiring absolute precision and control, but it created comedy that needed no translation, that audiences anywhere in the world could understand and enjoy. Jackie noticed several specific techniques that silent comedians used repeatedly. One was the principle of escalation, starting with a small problem that gradually became larger and more complex until it reached absurd proportions. Chaplin might begin a scene trying to eat a meal, encounter a minor obstacle, then through a series of mishaps end up in complete chaos, all without ever breaking character or asking for sympathy. The audience laughed because they could see the logic of how one small mistake led to catastrophe, and because Chaplin's commitment to solving the problem never wavered even as the situation became increasingly hopeless. Another technique was the use of props and environment as active participants in the comedy. Buster Keaton was particularly masterful at this. He would build sequences around objects, a collapsing house, a runaway train, a boat, a ladder, and his comedy came from his physical interaction with these objects. In one famous sequence, the entire facade of a house falls forward, while Keaton stands in exactly the spot where an open window passes over him, leaving him untouched but having come within inches of being crushed. The stunt was genuinely dangerous. The measurements had to be perfect, or Keaton would have died. But it was also perfectly timed comedy, with the humor coming from the contrast between enormous danger and Keaton's complete lack of emotional response. Jackie recognized this as something he could adapt to action cinema. Hong Kong martial arts films typically use sets and locations as neutral backgrounds for fights. The environment was where action happened, not something that participated in the action. But what if Jackie designed fight scenes the way Keaton designed comedy sequences, using the environment as an active element? What if he fought with ladders, chairs, tables, using everyday objects the way Keaton used props? What if he created escalating sequences where a simple confrontation became increasingly complex and chaotic through a series of complications? There was also the question of character. Chaplin's tramp character was vulnerable, often poor or disadvantaged, facing powerful opponents or difficult circumstances. But the tramp never gave up, never lost his dignity, never stopped trying to solve problems even when solutions seemed impossible. The audience rooted for him not because he was strong or skilled, but because he was persistent and creative, finding ways to survive through cleverness and determination. This was completely different from Bruce Lee's characters, who won through superior martial arts ability and intimidating presence. Jackie realized he could create characters more like Chaplin's tramp, ordinary people who got into situations beyond their abilities, who were scared and overwhelmed, but who persisted anyway, who won through ingenuity rather than dominance. This aligned much better with Jackie's own personality and physical presence. He wasn't intimidating like Bruce Lee. He couldn't make audiences believe he could destroy opponents effortlessly, but he could make them believe he was trying his best, struggling against the odds, using whatever was available to survive. The films that resulted from this realization, Snake in the Eagle's Shadow and Drunken Master, both from 1978, showed clear influence from silent comedy even though they were martial arts films. Jackie's character in both films started weak and clumsy, getting beaten repeatedly, looking genuinely distressed and scared. The comedy came from his attempts to avoid fighting, his use of unconventional tactics, his interaction with the environment and props. And crucially, Jackie showed the pain. When he got hit, it hurt visibly, and the audience could see him struggling to continue. This was revolutionary in Hong Kong action cinema, where heroes typically showed no pain, where getting hit barely slowed them down. Jackie showed every impact, every fall, every moment of exhaustion. This made the eventual victories more satisfying because the audience had seen how much effort they required. And the influence of Chaplin and Keaton was visible in how Jackie choreographed sequences, starting simple and escalating to chaos, using every object available, maintaining precise timing even in complex movements, showing vulnerability and persistence rather than invincibility. One specific sequence Jackie created that showed direct Chaplin influence was in Police Story, 1985, where he fights through a marketplace using umbrellas, bicycles, vegetables, anything within reach. The sequence is choreographed like a Chaplin routine. Each object creates a specific gag or action. The chaos builds logically from one problem to the next, and Jackie's character is clearly improvising, grabbing whatever he can find to defend himself. This was completely different from typical martial arts sequences where fighters used predetermined techniques and formal patterns. Jackie also adopted Keaton's principle of showing the audience exactly what was happening without editing tricks or camera deception. Keaton would perform dangerous stunts in wide shots with no cuts, allowing audiences to see the full scope of what he was doing. There was no question about whether it was really him, whether the danger was real. You could see everything clearly. Jackie applied this to his fight scenes, using longer takes and wider shots than was typical in Hong Kong action cinema, letting the audience see the full choreography rather than hiding imperfections through rapid editing. This approach required much higher skill levels from Jackie and his stunt team. When you edit rapidly, you can hide mistakes, can use different takes for different parts of a sequence, can create the illusion of continuous action from fragments. But when you shoot in long takes with wide frames, everything has to be perfect in a single execution. One person missing their timing ruins the entire sequence. This was exactly the standard Keaton had worked to. Every stunt had to be perfect because there were no second chances, no editing tricks to fix mistakes. The influence went beyond just techniques to philosophy. Both Chaplin and Keaton had complete creative control over their films. They wrote, directed, starred in, and often produced their own work. This allowed them to create exactly the comedy they envisioned without compromise. Jackie recognized that to fully realize his vision of action cinema, he needed the same level of control. He couldn't just be an actor following someone else's direction. He needed to choreograph his own action, direct his own films, control the editing and final product. By the 1980s, Jackie was doing exactly that, functioning as writer, director, star, choreographer, and often producer on his films. This was exhausting. He'd work 18-hour days, supervising every aspect of production, performing dangerous stunts, then editing late into the night. But it gave him the creative freedom that Chaplin and Keaton had enjoyed, the ability to realize his vision without interference or compromise. And like those silent comedians, Jackie was creating work that transcended language barriers, that audiences anywhere could enjoy without understanding Cantonese or reading subtitles. There's a specific moment in City Hunter, 1993, where Jackie directly referenced silent comedy. His character gets hit on the head and hallucinates that he's in a Street Fighter video game. The sequence that follows is pure physical comedy with minimal dialogue, exaggerated movements, impossible physics. Exactly the kind of thing Chaplin or Keaton might have done if they'd been making films in the 1990s. Jackie was acknowledging his influences openly, showing audiences where his approach to action comedy came from. But Jackie also understood that he couldn't simply copy silent comedians. The context was different. Audiences in the 1980s and 90s had different expectations than audiences in the 1920s. Films had sound, color, different pacing. Martial arts action required different choreography than physical comedy, so Jackie's approach was synthesis rather than imitation, taking principles from silent comedy and adapting them to Hong Kong action cinema, creating something new that honored his influences while being distinctly his own. One principle Jackie took from Chaplin was the importance of character consistency. Chaplin's tramp was the same character across multiple films. The costume, the mannerisms, the personality remained constant even as stories changed. Audiences came to know and love the tramp as a recurring friend. Jackie created a similar consistency across his films. While the specific characters and stories varied, the core personality remained the same. Ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances, reluctant to fight but capable when necessary, creative and persistent, showing genuine fear and pain but never giving up. This consistency created trust with audiences. They knew what a Jackie Chan film would be. They knew his character would get hurt and keep going, would use the environment creatively, would eventually win through persistence rather than dominance. This was the same kind of trust Chaplin had built with his audiences, where people came to see the tramp not because of the specific story, but because they enjoyed spending time with that character, seeing how he'd handle new challenges. From Harold Lloyd, Jackie learned about the importance of the thrill comedy, sequences that combined genuine danger with humor. Lloyd's famous scene hanging from a clock face on a tall building was both terrifying and funny, creating tension through real risk while maintaining comic tone through Lloyd's desperate attempts to hold on. Jackie applied this directly to his stunts, creating sequences that made audiences simultaneously laugh and gasp, that were entertaining but also clearly dangerous. The ending sequences of many Jackie Chan films show this influence. The final fight or stunt is often the most dangerous and also the most creatively funny, combining maximum risk with maximum entertainment value. The pole slide in Police Story, where Jackie slid down a pole wrapped in electrical lights and crashed through a glass ceiling, was both a spectacular stunt and a perfectly timed piece of physical comedy, with Jackie's increasingly desperate attempts to hold on, creating humor even as the danger became more extreme. Jackie also learned from silent comedians about the importance of showing failure. Chaplin and Keaton's characters failed constantly. Attempts to solve problems went wrong, plans backfired, simple tasks became complicated disasters. But they kept trying, and the comedy came from watching them persist through failure. This was very different from typical action heroes who succeeded through superior ability. Jackie made failure and struggle central to his action sequences. His character would try something, it wouldn't work, he'd try something else. That would fail too, and only through repeated attempts and creative problem solving would he eventually succeed. This made victories feel earned rather than inevitable. When Bruce Lee's character won a fight, it was because he was simply better than his opponents. The outcome was never in doubt. When Jackie's character won, it was because he'd persisted through multiple failures, had adapted and improvised, had used everything available and pushed through pain and exhaustion. The audience felt the effort because they'd seen every failed attempt that preceded success. There's a deeper philosophical similarity between Jackie and the silent comedians that goes beyond just technique. Chaplin, Keaton, and Lloyd were all making comedy during and after World War I, a period of enormous social upheaval and suffering. Their films offered audiences escape and comfort, showing ordinary people facing adversity with dignity and humor, persisting despite hardship. Jackie came from similar circumstances, grinding poverty in his childhood, brutal training at the opera school, years of struggle in the film industry before achieving success. His films offered similar messages, that ordinary people could overcome extraordinary challenges, that humor and persistence mattered more than power or privilege. This resonated with audiences across Asia and eventually globally because it was fundamentally hopeful without being naive. Jackie's characters acknowledged that life was difficult, that they were overmatched, that they were in real danger, but they kept going anyway, finding creative solutions, using whatever was available, refusing to surrender. This was the same spirit that animated Chaplin's Tramp. Dignity and persistence in the face of hardship, humor as a form of resilience. When Jackie's films began reaching Western audiences in the 1990s, critics and film scholars started recognizing the connections to silent comedy. Articles and analyses drew parallels between Jackie's action choreography and Keaton's physical comedy, between Jackie's character types and Chaplin's Tramp. Jackie himself talked openly about these influences in interviews, crediting Chaplin and Keaton as his primary teachers in how to combine physical performance with emotional storytelling. This created an interesting cultural circle. Silent comedy had been a universal language in the 1920s, enjoyed by audiences worldwide regardless of spoken language. Sound films had broken that universality. Movies became language-specific, requiring dubbing or subtitles for international distribution. But Jackie's action comedy, built on the principles of silent film, restored some of that universal accessibility. You could watch a Jackie Chan film without understanding Cantonese and still follow the story, enjoy the action, connect with the character, because so much was conveyed through physical movement rather than dialogue. Some of Jackie's most successful films have relatively minimal dialogue and could almost work as silent films if the sound was removed. The action carries the narrative, the physical comedy creates emotional connection, and language becomes secondary to movement and visual storytelling. This was exactly what Chaplin and Keaton had achieved in the silent era, and Jackie had successfully translated those principles to modern action cinema. There's also a shared vulnerability in how these performers use their bodies. Chaplin was small and slight, not physically imposing, yet his films had him confronting bullies, authority figures, difficult circumstances. Keaton was similarly unprepossessing physically, but he performed stunts that required extraordinary strength and control. They succeeded through skill and persistence, rather than through intimidation. Jackie, while athletically exceptional, was similarly not physically intimidating. He succeeded through technique, timing, and willingness to take damage, rather than through raw power. This made all three performers more relatable than physically imposing action stars. Audiences could imagine themselves in similar situations, could identify with the fear and struggle, could feel satisfied when the underdog character eventually succeeded. It's harder to identify with an invincible hero who was never really at risk. It's easier to identify with someone who's clearly scared, clearly struggling, clearly human. As Jackie aged and his body accumulated injuries from decades of stunts, his approach became even more similar to Chaplin's late career. Chaplin's later films showed an older character, less physically capable, but no less determined, using wit and creativity to compensate for reduced physical abilities. Jackie's films from his 50s and 60s show a similar evolution, less reliance on pure acrobatics and more on timing, positioning, creative use of props and environment. The character is older, slower, but still clever and persistent. This aging process is itself something silent comedians dealt with in ways that later action stars rarely had to. Chaplin made films across 5 decades, his physical abilities changing over time. Jackie has now made films across 6 decades, and his approach has evolved while maintaining core principles learned from those silent comedy masters. The specific techniques changed as his body changed, but the fundamental philosophy that physical performance should be authentic, creative, and emotionally honest remained constant. For viewers who grew up watching silent comedy or who appreciate classic cinema, Jackie's work represents a continuation of traditions that seemed lost to modern filmmaking. The careful choreography, the precise timing, the use of practical effects rather than digital manipulation, the commitment to real physical performance, these were values central to silent comedy that largely disappeared from mainstream cinema. Jackie kept them alive, adapted them to new contexts, and demonstrated that audiences still responded to authentic physical performance. There's something moving about watching a Jackie Chan film from the 1980s or 90s and recognizing echoes of Buster Keaton from 70 years earlier. A similar stunt structure, a similar comic timing, a similar willingness to risk the performer's body for the audience's entertainment. It demonstrates that good craftsmanship transcends time and culture, that principles of physical comedy and visual storytelling that worked in the 1920s still work today if applied with skill and commitment. Jackie has said in interviews that he wishes more young filmmakers would study silent comedy, that the lessons those films teach about visual storytelling and physical performance are as valuable now as they ever were. In an era of increasing reliance on digital effects and rapid editing, the patient craftsmanship of silent comedy, where everything had to be real, everything had to be perfectly timed, everything had to be captured clearly for the audience to appreciate, offers important alternative approaches to creating memorable cinema. The relationship between Jackie Chan and the silent comedians he studied is ultimately about respect for craft and recognition that excellence has lineage. Jackie didn't invent physical comedy or creative action choreography. He learned from masters who'd come before, studied their techniques, understood their principles, and adapted them to his own context. He honored his teachers by building on their work rather than trying to copy it, by taking their lessons and creating something new that nonetheless carried their spirit forward. For those of us who remember watching Chaplin or Keaton films in childhood, or who discovered them later through repertory screenings or film studies, watching Jackie's work offers a unique pleasure. Seeing beloved traditions continue, seeing craftsmanship we thought was lost still being practiced, seeing that the language of physical comedy and visual storytelling that entertained our parents and grandparents can still entertain us and our children. That continuity across generations and cultures is rare in cinema, and it's a testament to both the foundational work of silent comedians and Jackie's skill in adapting their lessons that this tradition remains vital and relevant decades after many assumed it had become obsolete.